It. Hey everyone, Sayre at Nova, and this time around we are talking about a pretty special bike, 1967 BSA Spitfire Mark III. The Spitfire was the factory hot rod version of the Lightning. So, as you may or may not know, the Lightning was the twin carb sports version of the A65 unit construction engine designed by Bert Hopwood in the early 1960s, made them 500s and 650s. The single carb being the Thunderbolt, and then the Spitfire was one of the factory hot rods. So basically, they put in a hotter cam, higher compression pistons, and I believe bigger carbs. So just kind of they they wrung whatever power they could out of this thing, and it was pretty popular. One thing I like about this bike is that in 1967, this was one of the fastest production bikes you could buy. Maybe there's something out there that was perhaps a little bit faster, but for a mainstream machine, you couldn't really get a better top speed than this thing. Hunter S. Thompson, famous writer, he bought one. I think his was a little bit earlier, and not a Spitfire, but a Lightning. But after reading the Hot Rod magazine, it said it was the fastest motorcycle they had ever tested. He went out and bought one and rode one, and a lot of his exploits that he writes about were on that machine. But what's cool about it is that this is a pretty ancient-looking machine by a lot of standards, and this is right on the cusp of a huge change in motorcycling. And if you watch these videos, we talk about that era a lot. Late 60s into the late 70s was hugely transformative in the world of motorcycles. So in 1967, you have this bike being the fastest production bike you can possibly buy. 68, the BSA triple took over, 3-cylinder, not that much more advanced, gobs more power though. And then by 1969, you had the Honda 750 and the Kawasaki H1 triple, 500cc two-stroke triple, which just blew all the Brit stuff out of the water. And this time, this is still a cast iron cylinder. This jug itself, if you dropped it on your foot, you would break your foot. It's heavy. It's really designed in the 1930s, as most Brit stuff was. They had thankfully graduated to aluminum cylinder heads and aluminum rocker boxes. They had thinning on their rocker boxes, and the unit construction, which is where the transmission is cast integrally with the engine. Unlike most modern machines, it looks similar, with the transmission being the same crankcase, same housing as the engine. It still is separate transmission. You still have separate transmission oil. You have separate primary oil and separate engine oil. So it's not really a fully unit motor, but they call it unit construction because it's one piece, as opposed to the pre-unit stuff, which had a separate gearbox, separate primary, separate engine. So it's moving things along, and Bert Hopwood he was kind of grumpy about this bike because he had designed it to be an intermediate step. The British were dragging their feet on introducing the multi-cylinders. He saw the Japanese catching up. He wanted a new machine. The brass who ran the company said, well, we're not paying for a new machine, so do what you can. He made this trying to be an intermediate step to an actual overhead cam motor, things that were far more advanced, and the brass never took him up on it. And a few years after this bike, 1972 was the last model year for BSA. So he saw the writing on the wall, just couldn't do anything about it. You got a still of its time, a drum brake. Obviously, that was the norm in the 60s. But when we come around this side, you can see this is still a single leading shoe brake. So even twin leading shoe brakes were considered high tech and far too advanced. All the Japanese bikes were coming with them by this point in time. You had the Honda Black Bomber and the CB77. They all had twin leading shoes, and the Yamaha and Kawasaki and Suzuki two-strokes also came with twin leading shoes. So BSA was behind the curve on this one. It's a big brake. It actually works fairly well, but it just shows you how far behind they really were. And the status that they had making fast machines and being relatively popular was really just sort of left over. They weren't doing much new at this point. They were sitting on their laurels and hanging on to what they could before they really got steamrolled. So this bike in particular is a good example of how we see a classic bike come into the shop. Somebody bought it as a new purchase to them, didn't run, had leaks everywhere. We kind of have to reverse engineer a lot of what had happened. Somebody had clearly done some work on it, had a Boyer electronic ignition, There's marked. There's evidence that somebody has been through here. There's new stuff in the new alternator, but he had no spark, and it was just leaking oil like a sieve. There was oil pouring out of the tachometer drive. So what I've done so far is I've gone down and pulled the oil pump off, and I've stoned the surface of the oil pump flat because they get warped. And this one actually had some casting marks that were holding it off of the engine case where it sits. So it was basically not sealing and not allowing the oil check valve to stop it and do its job, and just oil was just going straight through the thing. So that's interesting. And then again, there's covers on this side cover. And anytime we get into an old machine, especially an English bike, but any old machine, we end up using just your average sharpening stone to clean up the surface of the covers that we're putting back on. They get incredibly warped with time. They also get gouged by people taking them off. And then this cover has the worst sin you can possibly do. We see it on a lot of things. Somebody took like sandpaper or even a power tool to it. No way that's ever going to seal again. So even though they had glued this thing on, it took me several hours to clean off the glue that they used to glue it together. Their glue couldn't stop it from leaking. So this primary cover was leaking. So I'm doing a lot of just going through and looking at stuff that was put together a little bit incorrectly. Another common thing is here's a wonderful tool and wonderful part for people who don't know Brit bikes. So the Sayre washer. This is used to tension the rocker arms and the head, so they can kind of float but not rock back and forth and make a ton of noise. So they can have enough movement to expand and contract. And whoever put it together just kind of pinched it. So the rocker was able to move far more than it should, and this was seized up in there, and that eventually would have broken off a piece of metal and dropped it in the motor. So thankfully, I had some used ones from parts bikes kicking around. I was able to find that. So we just kind of have to go through and look at a lot of stuff. I had to check the valves anyway, so it wasn't hard to see that. But I had to look twice. I didn't catch that when I first set the valves, and then I said, let me just double check the movement of those rockers, and there it was. There's something not quite right. Somebody had blown the boiler on this. This is very common. These machines, the Brit bikes, they use positive ground, which confuses people to no end. I can understand the confusion, but it's really, all it means is that your positive terminal of your battery goes straight to your frame, and that's your ground, and your negative terminal goes into your power. So people have a really hard time with that, and they double switch things around and end up hooking things backwards, and that is a sure death sentence for a boiler. Be hooked up backwards. So I'm fairly certain that's what happened to this one. Thankfully, you can buy just the replacement box. I had one kicking around that I was able to test with, and then I bought him a new box to put in, and now we have spark. Retimed it. So yeah, it should be ready to go pretty soon. So, a lot of these kind of projects are super open-ended because someone is like, well, it doesn't have spark and it leaks. So that could be a 2-hour job. That could be a 3-day job. That could be even more. So we have to kind of like get into it, see what we find, get to a point where we feel like we can safely start it and run it. And then, hopefully once we get to the point of running it, we've done some checks and there's not much left to do. I'm hoping that's the case with this one because I found a couple of the major leaks on it and gotten spark back. So we're in the process of buttoning it back up. A couple more covers to put on. I'm going to let it, sit overnight, watch for leaks to be sure we got it. And then hopefully tomorrow we'll be firing it up and ripping it around. When we do fire it up, we will absolutely take some video of it and put it up on the shorts feed. So stay tuned for that. And that's about it for today on this thing. If you have any experience with BSAs, I'm a BSA fan, even though I've become a snob and I own Nortons and Velocets now. I still love a BSA. I think they are well-designed machines, perhaps poorly executed, but well-designed. And as I said, this era from the late 60s into the mid-70s, this was, some people qualify this as a super bike that's pushing it, but it's getting to the point of where they were really pushing the power of machines to keep up with the American market and the arms race with the Japanese. So it's an interesting time, and it's the beginning, it's the end of BSA, really. It's their last, full machine, other than the triple, which is a different story, and it really represents basically a lot of good they could have done, and they did do. They're great bikes. So if you love these things, chime in the comments. We'd love to hear them. If you hate them, chime in too. We'd love to hear that. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it helps us out. And thanks for watching.